Most people think they are losing money because they spend too much. But in reality, most people are not losing money. They are losing something far more dangerous. They are losing compounding. And the worst part is that this loss almost never feels like a loss, because the behavior that destroys compounding rarely feels dramatic. It feels small, harmless, even normal. In fact, the habit that quietly destroys long-term wealth usually looks like nothing more than a tiny decision made over and over again. A small purchase, a small delay, a small emotional choice. None of these decisions appear financially catastrophic in isolation, but wealth is not built through isolated decisions. Wealth is built through time interacting with behavior, and when behavior consistently interrupts the compounding process, the financial damage does not appear immediately. It appears slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, which is why millions of intelligent, hard-working people spend decades believing they are financially stable, while unknowingly destroying the one mechanism capable of creating real wealth. Compounding, the most powerful financial force in the modern economic system, and also the easiest one to sabotage, not through big mistakes, but through tiny habits repeated every day. Because compounding does not care about your intentions, it only cares about your behavior. And behavior, unfortunately, is rarely rational when money is involved. Human beings are not designed to think in decades. We are designed to react to the present moment. Our brain prioritizes immediate comfort, immediate satisfaction, immediate relief. And that psychological wiring creates a silent conflict with the mathematics of wealth. Because wealth grows slowly, almost painfully slowly at the beginning. The first years of compounding rarely feel rewarding. They feel insignificant. The growth looks small. The numbers barely move, which is exactly the moment when most people begin interrupting the process. Not because they lack intelligence, but because the human brain struggles to respect outcomes that are invisible in the present. Imagine two people starting with the exact same financial situation, same income, same opportunities, same access to information. The difference between them will rarely be knowledge, it will be behavior. One person consistently allows small amounts of money to remain invested and compounding over long periods of time. The other person repeatedly interrupts the process, sometimes through small spending decisions, sometimes through emotional reactions, sometimes through impatience, and sometimes through the simple belief that a small decision does not matter. But the mathematics of compounding is brutal in its honesty. Small decisions matter, not because they are large, but because they are repeated. A single financial decision rarely defines a person's wealth trajectory, but 10,000 repeated decisions absolutely do, and those decisions often happen so casually that they barely register as financial behavior. Consider something extremely common. A person receives extra income, not a massive amount, maybe a bonus, maybe a raise, maybe a tax refund. The amount is not life-changing, which means the decision feels unimportant, and that is precisely where the silent wealth killer begins to operate. Because when money feels small, discipline tends to disappear. The brain shifts from long-term thinking to emotional comfort. It's not that much. I deserve to enjoy it. I'll invest more later. Each of these statements feels harmless. Each of them feels rational. Each of them feels temporary. But financial behavior rarely happens once. It becomes a pattern, and patterns create trajectories. The problem is not the occasional decision to spend money. Spending is part of life. The problem appears when small decisions repeatedly interrupt capital accumulation, because every time money leaves the compounding process, something invisible disappears with it. Future growth. Future growth that never has the chance to exist, and that invisible loss is rarely calculated in the moment. Imagine removing $1,000 from an investment account. In the present moment, the loss looks simple. $1,000 less. But that is not the real cost. The real cost is what that money could have become over time, over 10 years, over 15 years, over 20 years. And this is where the human brain begins to struggle. Because the mathematics of compounding is not intuitive, it is exponential. which means the true financial impact of small decisions is almost impossible to feel emotionally. You can easily feel the pleasure of spending money today. You can easily feel the relief of using money in the present, but you cannot feel the absence of future growth. And because that absence is invisible, the habit continues. Day after day, month after month, year after year, small decisions slowly eroding the compounding process, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but steadily, quietly, until one day the person looks at their financial life and wonders why the numbers never grew the way they expected. They worked hard, they earned money, they avoided catastrophic financial mistakes, and yet the wealth never appeared. The reason is rarely one massive error. The reason is usually the accumulation of tiny habits that repeatedly interrupted compounding. Because compounding is fragile in the early years, it needs time, consistency, patience, and most importantly, non-interruption. But non-interruption is psychologically difficult because the modern economic environment constantly encourages the opposite behavior. Spend now, upgrade now, enjoy now, reward yourself now. And these messages are not necessarily malicious. They simply align perfectly with human psychology. Immediate gratification always feels stronger than invisible future growth. The brain loves rewards it can feel. It struggles to respect rewards that only exist mathematically, which is why compounding quietly loses the battle in millions of financial lives. Not because people reject wealth, but because the habit of interrupting compounding feels harmless every time it happens, until the math finally reveals the cost. And by that time, the lost years cannot be recovered. The real tragedy of this pattern is not that people make bad financial decisions. Most people don't. The tragedy is something much more subtle. Most people make perfectly reasonable decisions that slowly destroy long-term wealth, because the habit that interrupts compounding rarely looks irresponsible. It often looks practical, responsible, even intelligent. This is where the psychology of money becomes dangerous, because financial destruction rarely arrives wearing the costume of stupidity. It usually arrives wearing the costume of normal behavior. Take something as simple as comfort. Humans naturally prefer stability, predictability, security. Our brain evolved to reduce uncertainty, to avoid discomfort, to prioritize safety in the present moment, and in most areas of life, this instinct works extremely well. But in the financial world, this instinct often creates invisible damage. Because long-term wealth requires a strange psychological behavior, it requires tolerating temporary discomfort in exchange for invisible future growth. And most people underestimate how difficult that trade really is. Imagine placing money into an investment that will grow slowly over the next 10 or 15 years. In the first year, the growth looks almost meaningless. In the second year, the difference is still small. Even after several years, the numbers may not look dramatic, which means the emotional reward is weak. And the human brain hates weak rewards. We prefer immediate feedback, immediate pleasure, immediate confirmation that our decisions are correct. This is why compounding creates such a strange psychological challenge. The early phase of compounding feels boring. It feels slow. It feels unrewarding, which makes the brain constantly question whether the process is even worth it. And when the brain questions the process, behavior begins to change. A small withdrawal here, a delayed investment there, a temporary decision to use money for something more enjoyable. None of these actions feel financially destructive, but compounding is extremely sensitive to interruption. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill. At the beginning, the snowball is small. The movement is slow. It barely feels like anything is happening. But as the snowball continues to roll, it collects more snow. It grows larger, heavier, faster. The growth begins to accelerate, and eventually the snowball becomes something powerful. But imagine stopping the snowball repeatedly during the early stage. Every time it begins to move, you interrupt it. Every time it starts to grow, you break the process. The snowball never reaches the phase where growth becomes powerful. That is exactly what happens when small financial habits repeatedly interrupt compounding. The person never experiences the explosive phase of growth, not because the opportunity was unavailable, but because the process was constantly reset. And the reset rarely feels dramatic. It feels small, a few $100s, a temporary withdrawal, a postponed investment. But the mathematics of time does not care about the emotional size of the decision. Time only cares about continuity. Compounding only works when time and capital remain connected, when money stays invested long enough for growth to multiply. But the tiny habit that quietly destroys wealth is the habit of breaking that connection, breaking it with small decisions, breaking it with emotional spending, breaking it with impatience, breaking it with the belief that small interruptions do not matter. And the most dangerous part of this habit is that it does not feel like financial self-sabotage. It feels like life. It feels like flexibility. It feels like enjoying money while you are still young. And there is nothing inherently wrong with enjoying money. The problem appears when enjoyment consistently replaces accumulation, when comfort consistently replaces patience, when emotional satisfaction consistently overrides long-term mathematics. Because wealth is not built through occasional discipline. Wealth is built through long periods of uninterrupted behavior. And uninterrupted behavior is extremely rare in a world that constantly rewards the opposite. Every day, the modern economy offers new ways to convert future growth into present comfort. Subscriptions, upgrades, experiences, conveniences, all of them individually small, all of them emotionally satisfying, all of them financially insignificant in isolation. But patterns do not operate in isolation. Patterns operate in repetition. And repetition is where the mathematics of compounding begins to break. Consider the difference between two financial lives over 15 years. Both individuals earn similar incomes. Both individuals understand basic financial principles. Both individuals intend to build wealth. But one individual repeatedly allows money to remain invested, while the other repeatedly interrupts the process with small decisions. Neither person feels dramatically different year by year. Their lives appear similar. Their financial choices appear reasonable. But over time, something invisible begins to separate them. Not income, not intelligence, not luck, but continuity. Continuity is the hidden advantage of compounding. The person who protects continuity allows time to multiply their capital. The person who repeatedly interrupts continuity prevents that multiplication from ever becoming powerful. And the tragedy is that the difference may not appear for many years. For a long time, the two financial lives may look almost identical, which reinforces the belief that the small decisions do not matter. But exponential growth has a strange property. The biggest changes appear late in the process, and by the time the difference becomes visible, the lost years cannot be replaced. Because compounding is not only about money, it is about time interacting with behavior. And time is the one financial asset that cannot be replenished once it is gone. Every year that compounding is interrupted is not simply a delay. It is a permanent loss of potential. Growth. Growth that would have multiplied in future years. Growth that would have generated additional growth. Growth that would have eventually created financial momentum. But when the tiny habit of interruption dominates behavior, that momentum never appears. The person keeps working, keeps earning, keeps managing money responsibly. And yet the financial trajectory remains flat, not because the person is reckless, but because the compounding engine never had the opportunity to run long enough. And this is where the uncomfortable realization begins to appear. The greatest threat to long-term wealth is rarely catastrophic financial mistakes. It is the quiet habit of small interruptions repeated over decades, interruptions that feel normal, interruptions that feel harmless, interruptions that slowly erase the most powerful financial force available to ordinary people. Compounding. At this point, most people expect the solution to be something technical, a better investment strategy, a more complex financial plan, a smarter way to manage money. But the real solution is much less exciting and much more uncomfortable, because the problem was never knowledge. The problem was behavioral continuity, the ability to allow money to remain untouched long enough for time to do its work. And that sounds simple. But psychologically, it is extremely difficult, because every stage of the financial journey tempts you to interrupt the process. In the early years, the temptation is Impatience. The growth looks too slow. The progress feels insignificant. The numbers do not appear impressive, which makes the process feel fragile and optional. Later, when income increases, the temptation becomes lifestyle expansion. More comfort, more upgrades, more rewards for the effort of working harder. Again, none of these decisions appear financially destructive. They appear justified, even logical. But each decision slowly moves capital away from the compounding engine. And every time capital leaves that engine, something invisible disappears. Future momentum. Because compounding is not only about growth, it is about acceleration. The first stage of compounding is slow. The second stage is steady, but the third stage is powerful. This is the stage where the numbers begin to move dramatically, where growth begins to feel real, where wealth begins to appear almost surprisingly fast. But most people never reach that stage, not because it is inaccessible, but because their habits keep resetting the process before acceleration begins. It is like restarting the clock over and over again. Every time money leaves the system, the timeline restarts, which means the explosive stage of compounding remains permanently out of reach. And because the reset happens gradually, the person rarely notices what is happening. Life continues. Income continues. Money flows in and out. Nothing feels catastrophic. Nothing feels irresponsible. But the compounding engine never builds momentum, which creates a strange financial illusion. The illusion that wealth is harder to build than it actually is. The illusion that financial growth requires extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary opportunities, extraordinary risk. In reality, one of the most powerful advantages in wealth building is simply the absence of interruption, allowing time and capital to remain connected, allowing growth to accumulate quietly, allowing the process to become boring, predictable, unexciting. Because the truth about compounding is something that many people never hear. The most powerful financial process in the world is also one of the most emotionally unsatisfying in the beginning. It rewards patience long before it rewards excitement. And patience is difficult in a world designed around stimulation. Every advertisement encourages immediate reward. Every social signal encourages visible success. Every comparison encourages faster progress. But compounding does not respond to social pressure. It responds to time. And time only works when behavior remains consistent, which is why the tiny habit that quietly destroys wealth is not overspending. It is not ignorance. It is not lack of opportunity. It is the repeated decision to interrupt a process that requires uninterrupted time. And once you see this pattern, something important begins to change. Financial behavior stops feeling random. The difference between wealth and stagnation begins to look more mechanical, more structural, less mysterious. Because when you observe financial lives over long periods of time, a strange pattern appears. The people who build significant wealth are not always the smartest. They are not always the highest earners. They are often the ones who simply protect the compounding process. They allow money to remain invested. They resist the urge to constantly reset the system. They tolerate the boredom of slow growth. They respect the mathematics of time. And over the years, that behavior creates something extraordinary. Not sudden wealth, not explosive success, but something much more powerful. Momentum. Financial momentum is what compounding eventually produces. A moment when the growth of capital begins to contribute more than the effort of labor. A moment when time begins to work harder than income. A moment when the system starts producing results that feel almost disproportionate to the original effort. But that moment cannot appear without the years that come before it. And those years require something extremely simple, but psychologically rare: consistency. Consistency in leaving money where it can grow. Consistency in resisting small interruptions. Consistency in understanding that the most expensive financial decisions are rarely the dramatic ones. They are the tiny habits repeated thousands of times, the purchases that felt harmless, the withdrawals that felt temporary, the delays that felt insignificant, individually small, collectively powerful. Because wealth is not destroyed by one catastrophic mistake. It is destroyed quietly, gradually, through patterns that seem too small to matter, until one day the person realizes something uncomfortable. The problem was never the market, it was never the income, it was never the opportunity. The problem was the tiny habit that kept disconnecting time from capital, and once time and capital are separated long enough, compounding disappears, not violently, not suddenly, but quietly, exactly the same way wealth was supposed to appear